first, I wanted to see if I could get each of you to give kind of a brief overview of the kind of data that you're gathering in your work, and what are you doing with it. So why don't I start? I'll start with you, Wei, and we'll go across.
Sure. Yeah. At DeepMap, we make a special kind of maps built for self-driving cars.
Okay. Okay.
So Perceptive Automata, what we're building is a module for self-driving cars that can look at people in the world, pedestrians, cyclists, and can understand their state of mind the way that people do. Does somebody want to cross the street? Does somebody know that my car is there? To do that, we care both about the sensor data, but what we really care about is how people look at that data. So really what we're getting is data about how humans look at the world when they're driving a car.
Okay. Raj?
At CMU, my group builds the complete software AI stack for self-driving vehicles. We collect, I guess, two broad categories of data, if you will. The first is building the maps that the vehicle needs to drive around. It needs information like where the roads are, how many lanes, where the stop lines are, where the intersections are, where the traffic lights are. That's one set of data. The other set of data is basically the vehicle needs to basically sense and recognize different kinds of obstacles, if you will, in the environment, pedestrians, other vehicles, buses, trucks, ambulances, fire trucks, and the like. So therefore, we need to collect lots and lots of data and basically train the software to basically classify those objects.
Okay.
So Waze, as most of you might know, is a GPS community-based navigation app. So a lot of the data that we use is basically both passive and proactively collected from our community. So it's basically users just informing us on all the traffic conditions so that we then can feature and work on the data to develop features and a better navigation system that gets them to a place faster and safer. And on the other hand, what my team does specifically here in New York is working closer with our partners, so typically cities like the Port Authority or New York City, event organizers like MetLife Stadium or other teams, and finally brands, some advertisers as well, on how they can use those patterns to make more educated decisions around mobility and how they can use that data to improve their services to the communities.
Okay. Now, one topic that came up when I was chatting with you guys to prepare for this panel today was one of the big sort of zeitgeist questions, I think, in the space of cars and data right now and autonomous vehicle development is quality versus quantity. Because there's everyone, you hear this refrain that data is the new oil, and everyone's crazy to figure out how they can suck up more data and make a business model out of it. But what are each of you doing to kind of ensure that your data is actually really useful, or maybe sift out the whey from the chaff there in terms of making it good? So whoever wants to jump in, go ahead, yeah.
I can take this. Well, I mean, as I mentioned, we are at DeepMap, we're making a special kind of maps for self-driving cars. Raj actually gave some perfect examples of what those maps will look like. I think one key thing that I want to call out here is that I think everyone's very familiar with the maps that you probably see every day on the phone. These are what we call the navigation maps, and they're specifically designed for humans to interpret and consume. When we're talking about self-driving cars, what self-driving cars really are, they are a bunch of real-time robots that are trying to sense and understand the world as it's driving maybe at very high speed on highways. So when we are making these maps, we are designing in that framework, meaning that we actually need to produce maps that are specifically designed for robots to consume. And these maps need to be consumed extremely fast and reliably for a real-time robotic system. So going back to quantity versus quality, quality-wise, oftentimes in the mapping world, people will talk about precision and accuracy. When it comes to navigation maps, people typically measure the maps, or accuracy of these maps are typically measured in easily meters or sometimes tens of meters, depending on where you're looking at. When you're building a maps for a robot is much dumber than a human, unfortunately. So when you're making these maps for a real-time robot, the maps needs to be highly, highly precise. And then oftentimes we're talking about centimeter level precision and accuracy. But precision is only one aspect of quality for self-driving maps. the ability to actually map everything, as Raj mentioned. If you're at an intersection, if there are 10 traffic lights and 6 different traffic signals, all of that information needs to be correctly encoded, and you cannot miss any of them. And these maps need to perform extremely efficiently so that the cars can consume these data every few milliseconds while it is driving on the highway system.
Okay. Anybody else? How are you tackling that problem? How do you think about it?
So first of all, I think everyone's going to tell you it's quantity and quality. Like no one's going to say, you get quality data, and then no one's ever going to tell you they want fewer hours of data. But for us, when we have, say we have an hour of data driving in the city, there's hundreds of pedestrian interactions. For each of those pedestrian interactions, that's not useful to us until we know hundreds of things about how that interaction works out. So we will take those interactions, a half second, a second, just a brief slice of somebody walking across the road, and then we will manipulate them. We'll show them to large sets of people. We'll ask different kinds of questions, and we really dig in a very rich way into how do people look at that, and so that gives us these hundreds or even thousands of pieces of information about each of our moments of raw data, and that's when it starts being useful to us. So that's why it's the original data has to be good. We have to have it, but then if we don't know all of these things about it, then it doesn't buy us anything. You could drive around 1,000,000 miles, and without knowing how to look at the world, you're never going to get to production performance.
Yeah, with regards to the mapping data, I completely second what Wei just said. You want to really centimeter level accuracy of the maps, all the details and all its gory detail. So the quality has to be very high. With respect to recognizing things in the environment where the vehicle is driving, there is a very interesting trade-off between quality and being responsive, and then the computational power that it requires. For example, today your smartphone can actually get you pictures at 16 megapixels, right? So you can actually do high resolution video, 1080p, 2160p, and so on, very high resolution. But the problem with a self-driving vehicle is that if you get that high resolution image frame rate at 30 frames per second, you need to process every pixel, right? And that's going to be very demanding. You need to basically have extremely high-powered GPU graphics processing units, and that in turn requires a lot of power, it requires a lot of cooling, so the demands actually become overwhelming very quickly. What you want to do instead is basically get something like, for example, even something less than 1080p, and then maybe get something like 20 frames per second. If you're able to process that in real time and still operate the vehicle safely, you're good to go, right? So in terms of the other constraints. So basically, you want lower quality but better results.
Oh,
in real time.
So you don't want it to be too good because it would overwhelm the infrastructure of the...
The computational power is not sufficient, yes, that is correct.
Oh, interesting, okay.
Yeah, which is what Wei was alluding to as well.
Oh, okay.
Otherwise you have no space for people to sit in the car. It will be full of computers.
Right.
You basically have a big oven there heating up the car.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I think I want to build on something also that Sam said on the useful components. So on our end, there's different layers of quality of data. So there is whatever is user reported typically has a better level of quality. Let's say detecting a traffic jam is much easier if 3 people said there is a traffic jam here, I'm stuck, versus if algorithmically we noticed that people slowed down. So I think the really balance is not always necessarily a lot of quality and a lot of quantity, but enough of both to make a sound decision. And as Raj just said, is if you reach that moment where you can make the right decision, then you can have it. You can just reduce the quality or the quantity of the type of data you want for speed purposes and for decision making. For example, we work a lot with the port authorities here in New York. There are some decisions that are high overhead, meaning if they need to suddenly open a lane or close a lane in the tunnel, that's something you need to be sure that needs to happen. So the quality really matters. On the other end, though, sometimes we partner with organizations in other cities where we want to provide likelihoods of accidents in different areas with the data that we have, for them to be able to dispatch ambulances and emergency responses teams, but they just need to cover. So for them, if it's moving 4 blocks, even if there's a likelihood it might not happen closer to that highway, they might still take a decision. So they don't necessarily need quality that there will be an accident likely there, but as long as it reaches a threshold where it will make sense to move a little bit.
I see. So it sort of sounds like it kind of depends on what it's being used for.
Yeah,
kind of be flexible.
exactly.
And then also, the first point you made is that they kind of complement each other. Like there's certain things that those three people that might be enough.
Of course.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, mapping is really a big part of what we're talking about today, I think, because it's such a key piece of autonomous driving. Wei, I wanted to talk to you more about what that's like as a mapping company, trying to actually obtain that data. I know since I cover the auto industry, I was talking to an auto executive the other day, and he was sort of boasting to me like, our entire fleet of cars is going to be 100% connected by this date. And they see it as, now we're going to have all this rich data because our cars are connected. As a map startup, what are you driving around cars yourself? Are you embedded in certain fleets with partnerships with automakers? How are you collecting this data?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because map generation, or I should say data collection, is fundamentally a very big challenge. Because without good maps, you can't really drive safely. Traditionally, all the maps that you see on the phone are generated by the so-called survey fleet. I think probably many of you have seen Google Street View cars driving around collecting data. The challenge with that is that, first of all, these survey cars are very, very expensive to build because they need very expensive, high-maintenance equipment. Therefore, you cannot have many of them. So when we are collecting data for self-driving cars, yes, we do have a pretty small fleet for our prototyping and development purpose. But what we really do is that we partner with various OEMs and then sometimes tier 1 suppliers, so that we can actually embed the software that we build directly as part of a self-driving software stack. In essence, we're turning the cars that OEMs are going to produce into map-making vehicles. So they're not only on the recipient end, they're just not like a passive vehicle receiving information from the cloud, but they can actually go out and actually create maps. And when they see changes on the roads, for instance, like a tunnel being closed, or if there's road construction and so on, they can also in real time report this information back and then share with other cars in the fleet as well.
And what is the competitive dynamic like to forge those partnerships with automakers? Are they sort of welcoming anyone and everyone in to do that, or?
I think it's an interesting time, right? Like a lot of OEMs have their internal map team trying to make maps for themselves, which is absolutely needed because they need to understand the technology. Some OEMs are actively trying to work with partners such as us to solve this problem. I think overall, like setting DeepMap aside, I think mapping is a very large infrastructure challenge as well as a big data challenge. It's very unlikely that one party can solve this problem all by themselves. And this is one area where specializing or having a company that's specializing in this area and then solve the problem for all the OEMs or all the automakers actually makes sense. It's like having, I don't know, someone who is specializing in making wheels or airbag, and then by specializing that, someone can actually bring down the cost and then solve the scalability problem.
One other follow-up I have about that, what do you feel like as a, I mean, how long is DeepMap, when was DeepMap founded?
We were founded in April 2016, so we're about 2.5 years old.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what, you've got some sort of established players, the companies like a Here or a TomTom that, they did the navigational maps in our cars for GPS years ago, and now they're trying to, reinvent themselves as, bigger, this new kind of HD mapping for AVs. What do you, what kind of advantages do you have as a smaller player or as a newer player versus a big established juggernaut like that that's already got these established partnerships with automakers?
Yeah, I think, fundamentally, like being a startup has a lot of advantage, right? Like we don't have the baggage. We're designing from scratch. So when we're designing our solution, we're technology design-wise, we're slingshot directly into level 4 and level 5 self-driving. So we don't have to climb that ladder. We don't have to change, for instance, our existing database to kind of make it fit to self-driving needs. But instead, we're kind of designing from scratch and look at what problems self-driving car is trying to solve in real time, and then therefore how do we actually design a solution to fit that need. And of course, even though our company is fairly young, we have a lot of people who have been working in the mapping industry for a long time, for very many years. So.
Sure. You mentioned infrastructure. I think that's an interesting point I'd like to hear from other panelists as well. I've been thinking lately about how people talk about autonomous driving as it's this thing in the future, but already car makers are starting to introduce advanced safety systems on cars today, but they're already having trouble from a regulatory standpoint, or just various reasons, introducing that technology in the United States. And there's an example of Audi. They have the A8, which has level 3 driving features on it. So I think that's like hands off on the highway for a long period of time. That tech is ready. It's in production. I'm pretty sure it's available in Europe. It's not in the US. And one of the things they cite is why that's not happening. One, it's regulation and the fragmented regulatory bodies, cities, states, whatever. But it's also, they talk about infrastructure and how it's inconsistent in different states and things like that. So I'm just wondering if you guys have thought about that issue at all, and how you feel like maybe you could help solve that problem, if that's a bottleneck to bring this technology actually out into reality.
The one comment I would make is that the market for self-driving vehicles is supposed to be huge, right? Depending upon who you talk to, could be multiple $1 trillion per year in the 2030s, right? So that's a huge market, if you will. So I think there is a realization among the regulatory agencies that this is a huge market of the future. The technology was essentially invented in the US, and we'd actually maintain that leadership in the US and gain the market share. If we don't let this technology evolve and these vehicles actually apply the roads of the US, we will end up ceding this huge market to other players in other countries. So that realization is indeed there. The US DOT is basically taking this position that individual states have the rights to regulate human-driven vehicles, but the feds will basically maintain the right to quote-unquote regulate self-driving vehicles, right? So because it's a different domain, and therefore they want to maintain the rights, and therefore hopefully we'll actually have a uniform set of rules and regulations across all 50 states, instead of each state having its own tweak in it, in which case it becomes a total nightmare. Right. So I think things are headed in the right direction. I think they want to be flexible. They want to let their technology evolve. How things are going to evolve, nobody knows, of course. So therefore, the feds basically have to be nimble and be adaptive, something that you not normally associate with governments in general. So that's the challenge, but I think the realization is there, and hopefully that will happen.
Okay.
I mean, I would say, in terms of the regulatory environment, like, as Raj said, it's moving in a centralized direction, and I think that's really important, because even when you talk about something like traffic jam pilot, Audi's level 3 product, you're dealing with a system that is offloading pieces of the human driving task, and that has all kinds of implications for how the vehicle responds, how the vehicle exists in the world that don't attach to rolling out some kind of system where the person is still primarily in driving control of the car. So when you're talking about the performance of these systems, if you went to the states are like, okay, well, we license drivers using, we have our driver's test, you do your driver's test, and you're done. The driver's test is never going to measure the things that autonomous vehicles or even level 3 vehicles are going to be bad at. The issues that you're going to have, say you have a radar-based adaptive cruise control system, and it has a failure mode where there's a stopped vehicle and it can't detect a stopped vehicle. That's not something that happens to humans. Humans are going to see the stopped vehicle, so the failure modes are different. And especially when it comes to dealing with other people, other vehicles, the sort of unpredictability of human interaction, that's something that human drivers are effortlessly facile with, but we don't know how close we're going to get with autonomous vehicles, and they're really not there yet. So having a regulatory environment that can understand those kinds of things and understand that new approaches are necessary, I think is going to be a huge part of smoothing this process.
For sure, okay. But in terms of infrastructure, like lane markings are different, signage is different. This is not a huge issue. This is not it's like not a top of your list of problems to solve.
I mean, that's the engineering problem you have to solve, right? Like if you're not able to do that, then you haven't actually done what you say you're going to do.
And I think it goes in part with the regulatory organizations too. Different governments or places and different cities have different purposes and different ways they've designed their infrastructure. Typical things like cities like Manhattan are optimized to facilitate, I know it doesn't seem like this, but facilitate flow as much as possible, always in the realm of safety, versus other places that will guarantee safety much more. And you have like some solutions that are implemented into the infrastructure directly, sometimes into the software. But they go hand in hand. So I think like a lot of the regulation comes the regulation lifts come the moment you feel like your infrastructure is able to cope with the decision-making process or the decision, let's say, making of the different infrastructure components, right? So lighting systems, for example, whether a car is going to stop 99% of the time or make that right turn on the yellow light is something very fine-tuned, and depending on the regulations, then the infrastructure has to adapt.
Okay. Sam, what Perceptive Automata is doing, in some ways it seems like a sort of another frontier of all this, in terms of, I was very familiar with mapping and writing the algorithms and recognizing finite objects like a sign, but you're actually trying to make the robot understand human behavior. And I'm just curious, maybe you could to give people just a better sense of what that's like, maybe of a tough problem you're trying to solve. I've also had this, well, actually, go ahead, you say that, and then I'll go ahead.
Yeah, well, and for what it's worth, this is very much, you need maps to get on the road. You need to be able to steer the car. You need to be able to avoid fixed obstacles and moving obstacles. But really, if you look at what the task of driving is for people in an urban area, this is every bit as essential as that. We are looking at other people and making judgments about what's in their head constantly. So, for instance, you're driving down the road, there's a pedestrian or there's a person who's standing next to the side of the road, there's a crosswalk there, there's also a bus stop. Are they waiting for a bus or are they waiting to cross the road? If you had to slow down, would they think that they could walk in front of your car, or would they be confused because you're blocking the bus from getting to them? So those kinds of social inferences seem like this sort of next frontier, seem high level, but it's something that is just totally effortless for people and happens constantly in cities. And if you don't have that, you can't get level 4 vehicles on the road. And even with something like adaptive cruise control, you're going to have a system that it'll slam on the brakes for no reason, and then people will turn it off. So being sort of good citizens of the road, having this social understanding is very much as central a piece of urban driving as mapping, as knowing where street signs are, as knowing traffic patterns.
When I was learning about your company, I couldn't help but think about just sort of the mischievous or flat out dumb nature of humans in terms of what people will do when confronted with the new technology. And, we've had already with Tesla, with autopilot, you had people taping a soda can to the steering wheel to trick the car into thinking that their hands were on the wheel. You've got viral videos of people jumping out of their car in neutral and doing like a dance on, like there's all kinds of crazy things that people do. And so when I thought about, so now there's going to be like a robot car that's trying to understand me, well, why don't I just jump out in the road to try to fake it? Or, like it could be a dangerous game, but people take a lot of risks. So I mean, how is a robot ever going to understand something like that? Like if people are being funny or they're making a joke or all kinds of weird trolling behavior that.
Yeah, no, and people are totally going to troll them. I mean, I'm tempted, right? It's going to be really fun. So but what I would say is that people, when they're confronted with a system they don't understand, they probe it because they want to understand the parameters of that system. If self-driving cars react in a familiar way, if the way that they drive is comprehensibly like the way that humans drive, then it's going to fade into the background. You're going to be like, okay, that's a robot car, but it drives like a car. So if I want to cross the road, I should make clear that I want to cross the road. If I don't want to cross the road, it'll figure it out. So the sort of more they can get to behave in a familiar way, even though the underlying technology is very unfamiliar, the more they're going to fit seamlessly into the world, notwithstanding that people will certainly try to troll them here and there.
Okay. Raj, you've been studying this stuff for a long time. So, and Raj, I don't know if everyone knows this, he also already founded a company called Automatica that was bought by Delphi, now Aptiv, which is a key piece of their whole sort of self-driving transformation as an auto supplier. So I'm just curious to hear you sort of a long view of where we are. It's almost like the poll question, I guess. Sure. But I'm curious what your opinion is.
So we have come very far since 2007 when the DARPA Urban Challenge was conducted. 6 teams completed the competition. CMU won the race. So that's basically what initiated this whole spate of activity since then. Since then, hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more, have been invested. So that being said, I will make the following assertion. Driving is the most complex activity that most adults on the planet engage in on a regular basis. Don't do this at home. When you're on the highway, if you close your eyes for 2 seconds, you could end up being a victim. Exactly, there could be a fatality right there. 2 seconds. I cannot imagine any other activity that we engage in where that can actually happen on a regular basis. So it turns out that even though lots of money has been invested, many people come into the domain, build a car that can steer itself, apply gas and so on, and they say, oh, in 2 years we'll have this ready, fully autonomous vehicle. And then pretty much to every person they realize that it's a lot more complex than they ever imagined. And therefore all the dates that many companies, I won't mention any names, saying 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2021, you can actually list those names, and I can say all those deadlines are going to be blown. Right? It's going to be many more years before full automation actually happens. But along the way, I guess there will be intermediate levels of automation, automatic emergency braking. Because even if you are distracted, the vehicle does the right thing, alerts and stops at the right time, slows down for a pedestrian crossing the street that you did not notice, and so on. So there will be multiple benefits along the way. And then I guess if the highway is actually well marked with the lane markers and such, you can basically relax a little bit and keep going. Or at some point, the vehicle will say, hey, take over. You have to be paying attention enough to basically take over and such. So there will be benefits along the way. And full automation will be possible in some geographically constrained regions where the weather is nice, where it does not rain, where it does not snow, and so on. And then later on, eventually we'll get to places like Manhattan. And then much later than that, we'll get to places like India and Vietnam and Cambodia, right? So that will take many decades.
Okay, so what was your answer to the poll question then? So we're talking post-2040, it sounds like, for full level 5, full-on autonomy.
I guess for at least in portions of the US where the driving etiquette is much nicer, the driving culture is good, I would say we're talking about 10 years or so.
For level 5?
For level 5.
Okay. How much is every autonomous driving company is doing this? Or you talked about Uber in Pittsburgh driving around, kind of map the area. Is that a bottleneck for people? Yeah.
Just driving around in mapped areas?
Yeah. I mean, just having to collect that data. Yeah.
So I guess there are lots of companies like Waze company collecting the map data. I guess about 10 million cars get 50 million cars get sold in the US every year. If they basically add that mapping capability with GPS and so on, you could collect lots of data, post-process that. So it will take time, but the data will get there. So the question then becomes, what is the business model? Who are you going to buy it from? How are you going to keep it updated? Is it Waze? Is it going to be here or TomToms? So those issues should still be resolved.
Okay. It looks like we're out of time. So thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed this, and thank you all.
Thanks.